Hi everyone, as I promised, a video on assessment of arguments. In the last video I talked a little bit about what types of arguments are and what the components of arguments are. So I talked about premises and conclusions, and then I also talked a little bit about deduction and induction. Now that you've got that basic overview, you want to also know how to assess arguments. And the assessment of arguments works differently in both deduction and induction. Here's the overview. I'm going to do induction first because deduction is really the more important of the two, and induction is actually a little bit more difficult, so I'd like to address that first. With inductive arguments, the way to assess the argument is to first determine whether it is strong or weak. Strong or weak. So, inductive arguments are either strong or weak, and in this case, we're going to think of this as a kind of spectrum. So, we call them strong or weak, but you really want to be thinking of a spectrum that goes from strongest or perfect strength, whatever that might mean, to weakest or perfect weakness, again, whatever that might mean. Okay, that's the first assessment. With induction, after you've determined whether an argument is strong or weak, you then go on to determine whether it is cogent. Okay. Inductive arguments that are strong are either cogent or they are uncogent. Inductive arguments that are weak are always uncogent. Okay, I'm going to repeat that, the whole overview, before I move on. Inductive arguments are either strong or weak. Strong inductive arguments are either cogent or uncogent. Weak inductive arguments are always uncogent. Alright, so now let me explain what all of this means. What is a strong inductive argument? A strong inductive argument is one where there is a tight relationship between the premises and the conclusion. Or a strong relationship, if you will, if you don't mind the redundancy. Once more, a strong inductive argument is one where there is a strong or a tight relationship between the premises and the conclusion. So, let me explain further. What do I mean by strong or tight? I mean that the premises are strongly suggesting the truth of the conclusion. So, take a very simple case of induction, one that many of you have used in your own arguments, or that many of you will use in your own arguments. I know this just based on experience. I went to the mall yesterday. I went to the mall the day before that. I went to the mall every day for the last 6 weeks. Therefore, conclusion, I will go to the mall today. Now, is that a strong argument? Yeah, probably. You want to have a little bit of skepticism about that because you never know when, of course, this day might be different. But, in general, if you've got 6 weeks of data points and today is just any other day, then you'd probably want to draw the conclusion that this day is just like any other day, and therefore that the same thing will happen as has happened during the last 6 weeks. So, we would call that a strong inductive argument. Of course, if there are different considerations about today, then you want to be careful. Alright, so that's strong. The next question is that cogent? Well, the cogency question has to do with whether or not the premises in the argument are actually true. For purposes of strength, we simply assume the truth of the premises, and then we ask ourselves, well, if the premises were true, then does that mean that the conclusion has to be true? Now, within the boundaries of induction, the conclusion doesn't have to be true, but it is very likely to be true in that strong inductive argument that we just used. But does that mean that the argument is cogent? Well, no, not necessarily. In my particular case, it is false that I have been to the mall today or yesterday or every day for the last 6 weeks. Therefore, the argument would be called strong but uncogent. So, cogency is defined very simply according to whether all of the premises are true. If all of the premises of an inductive, strong argument are true, then the argument is cogent. If at least one of the premises is false in a strong inductive argument, then the argument is uncogent. And then finally, what happens with weak arguments? As I said earlier, weak inductive arguments are always uncogent. Okay, let me repeat the whole thing one more time just to summarize induction for us. When we assess inductive arguments, we want to know two things. Is the argument strong or weak? And if it is strong, is it also cogent? To determine strength, we simply test the relationship between the premise set and the conclusion to see if it is likely that the premises lead to the conclusion. And then to test cogency, we have to know whether the arguments are true or whether the premises are true or false. If they are all true, then a strong inductive argument is also cogent. If at least one of them is false, then a strong inductive argument is uncogent. In a weak inductive argument, the argument is always uncogent. All right, that is it for induction. Now on to deduction. Deduction also has two different assessments. The first assessment is the validity assessment. The second assessment is the soundness assessment. They work exactly like the assessments in induction work. So, let me explain. First, validity. Validity, like most of the stuff in our class, has a technical definition. And that technical definition is as follows. I need you to memorize this. I need you to know it by heart. Very important. An argument is valid if it is impossible for the conclusion to be false when we assume the truth of the premises. One more time. An argument is valid when it is impossible for the conclusion to be false when we assume the truth of the premises. So, simple example. If I have a red car, then it follows that I have a car. But flip the order of those two statements around, and you suddenly have an invalid argument. If I have a car, it does not therefore follow that I must have a red car. The first example is valid. The second example is invalid. Classic examples of valid arguments are named. They have names. They are patterns that have been identified over the centuries, in fact millennia now, 2,500 years at least, and we can identify them through their patterns or their forms. And the classic ones that I will name here, there are many more, but I will name just a few, are modus ponens, modus tollens, the hypothetical syllogism, the disjunctive syllogism, the constructive dilemma, the destructive dilemma, and many, many, many others. There are literally thousands of these. So, I just named a few forms that are valid, which means that no matter what you do with them, no matter what you plug into them, they will be valid. But validity is only the first assessment in deduction. There is also the soundness assessment. Now remember, with induction I said that a weak inductive argument must be uncogent. Well, in deduction, an invalid deductive argument must be unsound. So, let me explain what soundness is. It is exactly the same as it is with induction. An argument is sound if it is valid and all of the premises are true. One more time. An argument is sound if it is valid and all of the premises are true. So that means that valid arguments are either sound or unsound, and we determine whether they are sound simply by checking on the truth of the premises. If all of the premises are true, that valid argument is sound. If at least one of the premises is false, that valid argument is unsound. Okay. Now, what happens then to invalid arguments? They are simply, by definition, declared unsound. And that is it. You should get to know the forms of modus ponens and modus tollens at least. It helps also to know the forms of the disjunctive and hypothetical syllogisms. A little bit more advanced are the forms of the destructive and constructive dilemmas. This involves getting a little bit into logic and getting a little bit into logical forms and logical structures and logical symbolism, but not too deep. So, if you want to do a little bit of homework, if you want to educate yourself on this a little bit, I would study symbolic logic, maybe just get a brief overview. Even Wikipedia will be adequate for these purposes, although usually I'm not going to recommend Wikipedia, but anybody can get this right. And then just educate yourself on the symbolism. This will also help you do web searches. If you are familiar with Boolean search terms, for example, the and, the or, and the not, then you are already familiar with a little bit of symbolic logic, and this is probably nothing new to you. For our purposes, for class purposes, study the forms, understand the definitions of validity and soundness, understand the definitions of deduction and induction, and you are probably going to get 90% of our exercises and assignments correct. And that is it. Thank you for listening.